He wanted to be known as an all-round composer, and don't forget that there are two symphonies, a piano concerto, several overtures, and above all, of course, the opera.
He adored ballet. You know, one of the great disappointments of his life was that Celia Franken never asked him to write a ballet. I spoke to Celia at one time. She said, I was afraid it would be too churchy. And I said, you don't know my father.
He was, to my way of thinking, a very kindly old gentleman in spats. He always had his spats and his bow tie. And he was extremely kind to me and grandfatherly almost.
And also had that weird sort of spiritual and interest in ghosts and the spirit world. So a really complicated person. So I hope you find out who he really was with your investigations.
Healy Willan once said he was born with the ability to read music. Toward the end of his life, he became known as the Dean of Canadian Composers and had written over 800 works. Stephanie Martin, Associate Professor of Music at York University in Toronto, has had a decades-long interest in Willan's music and correspondence.
Initially, when I went to York University, I had a mandate to do research, so I spent a whole week in the archive looking at the Willan collection there. I thought it'd be a great idea to get Mary Willan to come up to Ottawa with me and just sit and read some of the letters. So that was a really great project. And down the road, it would be great to transcribe them and make them available to the public.
Healy Willan was born in Balham near London, England, on October 12, 1880. He came from a long line of doctors, schoolmasters, and clergymen. His father was a pharmacist and his mother an amateur musician. When Healy was 2, the family moved to Beckenham, a small village in Kent. Their home life was a happy and stable one, and when Healy was 4.5 years old, his mother became his first piano teacher.
Willan said that his first musical influence that really got him, hooked on music, if you will, was his mother's piano playing. So she used to play the piano frequently at home, and he used to enjoy the sound of it. That's the way he described it. He said, she wasn't a great pianist, but I quite enjoyed the sound of her playing. And from there, he went to St. George's Beckenham, the local parish church, and he figured out that the organist played every day during lunch hour, and so he used to go and spend his lunch hours there hiding behind a pillar and listening to the sound of the organ, and he was really taken with it.
I said, why'd you hide yourself? Well, he says, I didn't want to get thrown out. So I said, well, how long did that go on? Oh, he said, quite a long time. He says, when my mother found out where I was going, she knew where I was. And she decided that I should have some musical education.
In 1899, the Willans moved to the seaside town of Eastbourne, where there was an excellent choir school associated with St. Saviour's Anglican Church. On May 1st, young Healy climbed the steps of the school, feeling as if I were going to my execution. He became a dedicated student to Dr. Walter Sangster, who taught him harmony, counterpoint, and organ performance.
By the time he was 11, he was conducting the choir and playing the organ.
At Eastbourne, he would have sung every day. There would have been choir practice every day. There would have been quite a lot of emphasis on musical literacy, such as, the fundamentals of reading, which they would kind of impart that just by learning repertoire. And so there would have been services frequently during the week, and so he would have needed to prepare, canticles, hymns, psalm settings, and so forth. And it was also the tradition there to sing the psalms to Gregorian chant, which wasn't the tradition everywhere in psalm singing in England at that time, but the whole practice of chanting and the traditional Gregorian methodology of singing was something which had kind of had a renaissance, a comeback, if you will, as a direct consequence of the Oxford movement, a couple of generations before. But no one would have been singing in that manner for really a long time, so it had sort of come back afresh. And that was the environment that he grew up in. And so he ended up being, instinctively drawn to that music and, followed that passion throughout his entire career.
Willan's voice broke when he was 15, and when he finally left the school, Dr. Sangster told him, "Well, Willan, I'll miss you. You never had a great voice, but you never missed a lead." The superb education he received from Eastbourne held Willan in good stead as he went on to try his practical exam for Fellow of the Royal College of Organists.
By the time he reached age 18, he sat for his fellowship and got it at 18. And apparently, the average age for that attainment was 32.
The same year, Willan embarked on a career as a professional musician in London. He conducted various choirs and became organist and choirmaster of St. John the Baptist, Holland Road in Kensington, and began publishing his compositions.
He also had, personally, a task he'd set himself of trying to recover or uncover music of William Byrd that, of course, had disappeared for the most part. But he did find quite a bit, and not just William Byrd, but there was, I think, Tallis too, and others. And he found this music and got it republished and started putting to use.
In 1905, Healy Willan married Gladys Ellen Hall of London, and by 1911 they had 3 sons. Since Willan's salary at St. John's was only £100 a year, he accepted part-time work at Novellos, even proofreading Elgar's Second Symphony and The Music Makers. Fortunately, some of Willan's own compositions were known and appreciated by some influential people in Toronto. Willan set sail for Canada and was followed shortly thereafter by his family. In the early part of the 20th century, Toronto was not the booming cosmopolitan city it is today, as Canada's cultural identity did not really begin to flourish until after the First World War.
It became a center of commerce very quickly and was growing very quickly. But it would have been culturally pretty desolate. But what musical influences there were would predominantly have been British.
Well, Healy Willan was headhunted by the conservatory because he was so well known as a practitioner and someone who understood counterpoint and theory. They needed a head of the conservatory here in Toronto, the Royal Conservatory, to provide really quality education for musicians. So they headhunted him and they brought him over here in 1913.
There would have been very few really trained organists, certainly not to a recital standard. And with the incredible literacy he would have had in the music he was particularly interested in, that Gregorian tradition and the Renaissance tradition of polyphony, that wouldn't have been well known at all. And so he would have brought a particularly interesting mix of skills and interests to a cultural scene that really needed to learn about those things.
As head of theory at the conservatory, Willan made $3,000 a year. Within weeks, he managed to secure the position of organist and choirmaster of St. Paul's, Bloor Street, which brought in another $4,200, a far cry from the annual sum of £100 he had made in London.
And while he was at St. Paul's, he was really more known for his organ compositions, because the organ that was installed there at St. Paul's was the second largest organ in North America, second only to St. John the Divine in New York. So he had this amazing instrument, so he wrote a lot for the organ.
5?
Yeah, but I'll get them, Mary. Ta-da!
There we are. This is from Victoria College, October 8th, 1959. Dear Dr. Willan, I should be very pleased and honoured in your capacity as university organist if you could be present at my installation on October the 21st. And I should be particularly pleased and honoured if I could have your Passacaglia and Fugue, the second one in E minor, for either prelude or postlude. I'll send you an annotated program as soon as we have one. All the best, and with renewed thanks, sincerely, Northrop Frye.
Northrop Frye knew your dad's music so well
Yeah.
that he knew it was the second Passacaglia.
Yeah.
Right? The one in E minor.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Because World War I had begun in 1914, Willan's family had to come to Canada aboard a troop ship. Within a few years, all three boys were attending Upper Canada College, a private school for boys, thanks to the decent amount of money their father was making as a musician.
And you must remember that when they came over from England, they were 3, 5, and 7. So they'd had some years to become a family of 3 boys. My eldest brother had a tin ear, and so that was, I mean, that was that. My second brother liked music, and he liked it very much. He wrote a pop song once and sent it to a competition, which it won, and it was played in New York. Well, brother 3 became a drummer in the UCC cadet band. And he drove everybody crazy because no matter what he was sitting on, he had drumsticks and he'd be practicing.
In early July of 1920, the Willans moved their family into an old farmhouse on Inglewood Drive. And the following week, Gladys, or Nell as Healy lovingly called her, gave birth to a baby girl. A few months later, one of Willan's old school chums came to Toronto to conduct the Philadelphia Orchestra at Massey Hall. His name was Leopold Stokowski.
Dad and Mother went down to the concert, and they were sitting in the hall in the first gallery. Dad went down to see Leo in intermission, and Leo said, "Oh, where's Nell?" Dad said, "She's just had a baby, and we just had a baby, and she's this is her first time out, actually, after it was quite difficult for her." So people in the audience were quite surprised when the conductor appeared and greeted Mother and so on. We thought that was most amusing because, as Mother said, her baby and Leo's baby were born about the same time. And then later, Leopold Stokowski married one of the Vanderbilt, Gloria Vanderbilt. And she was the same age as I am.
Some years after Mary was born, her mother told her she was tired of raising little boys and had made up her mind that this final baby would be a girl. Mary had fulfilled her mother's wish, something her brothers wouldn't let her forget.
And all of a sudden there was this female in their group. And one of the things that they liked to do was tease me because I was a Canuck. I found that my skull was the strongest part of my head, so I just butt and hit them in the tummy as hard as I could.
None of Mary's brothers were destined for the world of music. All 3 became stockbrokers, an irony since both parents were musicians. Gladys Willan was very accomplished and had trained at the Royal Academy of Music in London.
Mother was a great pianist and a great singer. She was a beautiful mezzo. Oh, boy.
Lovely lady she was too. I liked her very much. But she knew her music. And when she had heard a piece or a performance, she would have done a fantastic job if she was a critic.
Well, she had played professionally in London after she married. It was the custom at that time for a man to say, you're my wife, you don't appear on the stage.
She had to give up her music career to bend to what he was doing.
And so instead of saying, nuts to you, I'm going to be on the stage, Mother didn't. And I think possibly she saw me as a budding pianist, and that's why she pushed me to have these music lessons, but I didn't want that. I wasn't particularly musical. I loved to listen to music, but I didn't want to perform or to produce music particularly. But what I wanted to do was draw and paint. And so one day my father asked me what I was doing in my room. I was so quiet. And I said, well, I have an art exam coming up, and I'm practicing. And he said, you'd rather do that than practice on the piano, wouldn't you? And I said, yes. And he said, right. You don't have to take music lessons anymore. Which endeared me very much to him, and that's the sort of relationship we had.
In 1920, Healy Willan decided it was time for a change. The rector's wife at St. Paul's had meddled once too often when it came to choosing hymns for a Sunday service. He knew Reverend Hiscox was looking for an organist and choir master at St. Mary Magdalene, preferably one steeped in the Anglo-Catholic tradition.
He says, it was near my birthday, so I gave myself a birthday present. He says, I severed my relationship with St. Paul's, and that's when he phoned Hiscox. He says, I've got your man for you. He said, well, bring him over.
Willan promptly went to St. Mary's Rectory and knocked on the door. Hiscox answered, looked around, and asked, so where is he? Willan responded, won't I do? Hiscox pulled him into the house, and according to Willan, the two of them proceeded to do a tremendous amount of damage to a bottle of scotch.
He went to St. Mary Magdalene's, and that's where he really started to blossom. And the place itself, the building, is really like no other building in Canada, because just walking in, there's this magical acoustic there, and the building sings back to you. So an inspiring place to write, and sympathetic clergy who encouraged him to write music for the liturgy, and also to involve the Gregorian chant choir up front and play with the geography of the building. So polyphony from the back, Gregorian chant from the front. It was a really magical combination.
But he with Hiscox, told him what he wanted to do, and Hiscox says, well, that's entirely up to you. He says, you're in charge of the music. That's it. It took him, because that was 1920, it took him 4 years to get things started.
There had been a men and boys choir there for some time. I don't think that he thought it was very good. So the choir was disbanded or drifted away, or I'm not exactly sure what, but he did not seek to restore it. He wanted to have a choral sound that was more detail-oriented, I suppose you could say, where he could achieve a particular sound that he wanted to fit into the aesthetic that he was creating musically. And adult women were more inclined to produce the kind of sound that he wanted than would have been possible with boys or girls.
I think about 1925 or 6, before he had a gallery choir that was about 20 membership or more. The organ, another matter.
The organ, the pipes, are actually located at the east end. The console, Healy Willan moved to the west end, which is a trick for the musician that has to play the organ from the console a football field away from where he or she is playing, and have the sound circulating around. So I've had organists sit down when I was at St. Mary Mag's to play the organ and be totally disoriented, not being really able to hear where the sound is coming from. So takes a little while just to sink into that acoustic playground because it's unorthodox.
I started my interest in Willan via his organ music totally when I was at school. I used to hover around the London music shops, and I saw this chap's name, Healy Willan. I thought that looks interesting, and I bought some of the music and I started to play it. And in fact, I was way beyond myself. I do remember having a copy of the Introduction, Passacaglia and a Fugue, and the only way I could play that is that the history master and I played it as a duet. I couldn't play it all on my own. Some of the other stuff I did manage to play when I was a boy.
What drew me to the organ when I was a choir boy listening to the sound of it was how effective it was at sort of creating mood or drama or color or pacing, all of these things in the context of liturgical services.
I went to St. Mary's one day and I could not work out what I was hearing. Was I hearing an improvisation? Was I hearing a work that he had written? Or was I hearing something from the repertoire that had escaped me?
And in a liturgical church such as St. Mary Magdalene, where there would have been quite a lot of pageantry around the liturgy that required music to be played, rather than find 45-second pieces for every liturgical action, he just made stuff up on the fly, really, that we call improvisation.
It was brilliant. He was a brilliant extempore player. And the beauty of it was that it was always germane to the purpose.
You know, the sacrament is being carried from A to B, or the priests are processing from here to here, or we're coming in the side door. The organ is sort of building all of this drama. It's creating, it's a bit like going to a movie and listening to the soundtrack. It has some of the same functions as that.
And as to the playing of the organ, it was old-fashioned. A lot of hymns started with a spread chord, for instance. I'd have failed every single exam I ever took if I started a hymn that way. But he spread the chord like that, and the choir sort of knew when the note was coming, which really was the starting note, little oing, and that's where we start on oing.
And he didn't really work things to death or stop you a lot to fix every little thing. Most of the people in the choir were very well-trained musicians or had a lot of choral experience. They were considerably older than me. Most of them would be in their late 20s and more. We went through weeks and weeks of material, very hard, difficult, challenging material, because, you know, his music's not easy to sing. And for a 15-year-old, it was pretty intimidating.
Maggie, I wanted to rise up my love, my fair one out. Rise up my love. I think that's about D flat.
The picture I have of Dr. Willan is exactly what you see in the film that the National Film Board did in 1959, I think it was. That's who he was, and that's exactly how he always looked.
Aside from his choral duties at St. Mary's, Willan attracted first-rate students to the University of Toronto, 4 of whom would later make their own impact on the musical world. Robert Fleming, Godfrey Rideout, Eldon Rathburn, and Elmer Eisler.
In the film, you would see Elmer Eisler, who is certainly one of Canada's most prominent choral musicians.
I think at one stage, Willan said, "Come on now, Elmer, smarten up, will you?" Or something out like that. It was Elmer was horsing around.
All right, Elmer, that'll be all right. We'll do that very soon now.
And he was a devotee of Dr. Willan's, and the earliest music that I remember learning in York Memorial Collegiate Choir, where Elmer was our music teacher, was Dr. Willan's music. Dr. Willan had retired from the university, and he wasn't seeing his students anymore. I'm sure he used to draw his choir members from his student body at the University of Toronto. But after he retired, he was a little out of touch with that community, and Elmer wanted to bring some of his students down to help Dr. Willan reinforce the numbers, and also for us to have the experience of learning all of that repertoire. But Elmer used to come around for us in his car and pick us all up, as many as he could get in the car, and take us home again. So that's just an indication of how committed he was to Dr. Willan.
Just think of the words. That's the most important part of all singing. Now, once again, from the beginning, right? Now. That was quite good. Quite good.
There had been almost no a cappella tradition of choral music composition in Canada when he came. And at first he didn't really write in that style because he had this great organ at St. Paul's, and the tradition there was for there to be lengthy anthems as reflection. And he must have had some very fine soloists as well, because a lot of the anthems that he wrote during that time have pretty substantial solo demands, often for tenors or for sopranos.
But they're also a little bit out there, kind of Elgarian in their derivation as well. So he was doing innovative things, but when he settled into St. Mary's, his music is more like Palestrina or the Russian Orthodox music.
And there wouldn't have been a lot of musical literature available for use in that kind of liturgy. So he provided it by composing it. So there was a practical side to that, because he needed music to be performed, and he needed the choir to sing something. And there just weren't that many a cappella unaccompanied settings of the Mass available to him.
So he wrote 14 Missa Brevis that's required to be sung at all Eucharist service. So he set that 14 different times.
We would premiere the Masses as they were being written, and it was just another piece. He didn't make a big deal out of the fact that this was the premiere performance of his new work or anything like that.
So his music didn't only bring attention to itself, it brought attention to music that was similar to it, or that sounded like it, that was composed in another historical time. It inspired him, and in the same way, his music inspired people to want to know more about the historical foundation that he was working in.
I'm sure there were an awful lot of organists. This is well known. A lot of organists went to St. Mary's to hear polyphonic music sung by a really decent choir that could hack it.
Without the Arts and Letters Club, believe me, Father would have packed his things and gone home.
Because that's where the artists, the writers, and many of the musicians congregated lunch, supper, dinner, entertainments, and all that kind of thing. That's where they clubbed.
I mean, this was the one thing in Toronto that had any sort of life to it, because Toronto was a pretty dead place.
But you could have gone to the Arts and Letters Club one day and seen Willan sitting there, Ernest Macmillan sitting there, and Arthur Lismer sitting over there.
Well, AY and I think Fred Varley, well, all of them. Can you use the word chums? Because that's what they were down at the club.
Willan's membership with the Arts and Letters Club lasted for more than 50 years. It was an all-male club which enjoyed the benefits of a lounge, a library, art studio, and a neo-Gothic great hall for concerts, plays, lectures, and meals. Willan set the club's constitution to music. He also wrote incidental music for plays and other entertainments.
At the Arts and Letters Club, I'm quite sure they talked, because if you didn't talk, you weren't a member. So get out.
I think in any really productive, creative period of time, there's always going to be push and pull. There's going to be the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the modernists and the conservatives. And certainly Healy Willan was more conservative.
Now, I can't tell you whether Willan would cut Sam Dolan dead if he met him in the corridor. You know, Sam Dolan for me representing, we'll say, a much, much, much more modern stream of music.
But that's just, again, it's part of the whole cultural ecosystem. You need people breaking the rules and doing new things, and you also need people who are writing things that that are going to be useful. And I think that's Healy Willan's legacy, because his music is still sung.
But they were united, I think, by the fact that they were musicians. And it was in that milieu that I think Willan found himself happiest after the church.
I'm going through an entire 2 folders of correspondence between Healy Willan and Sir William Mackay, who was responsible for the music at the coronation at Westminster Abbey. And I've just come upon the handwritten letter, "My dear Willan, I am very glad to be able to invite you to compose one of the homage anthems for the coronation service." Yeah, it's lovely. They really seem to have written to each other a lot.
But it was because of Sir William that the approach was made, certainly. Those were the strings that got pulled, because the organist at Westminster did not have the authority to ask a composer to compose something for the coronation. It had to come from the Archbishop with the approval of the Queen.
Perhaps his greatest honor came in 1953, when he was commissioned to write a special homage anthem to be sung in Westminster Abbey at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Not long afterwards, the Archbishop of Canterbury conferred on Healy Willan the degree of Doctor of Music. He is still active, and music continues to be, as he puts it, his profession, his relaxation, his hobby, and his chief delight.
Mother's role in that was what entertained me. She was to produce a tea tray and come around the corner of his room where he composed.
Hello, dear, hello.
Would you like some tea?
Yes, tea. Wait a minute.
Nobody told Mother that you don't have to have a fresh cup of tea every time. About the 34th or 5th time, she told the director, you know, it's very fortunate that you like this take because I was going to pour this hot tea over your head.
After a 60-year relationship with Healy, Gladys Willan died in December of 1964. In lieu of flowers, the family requested donations to the Humane Society, which reported there had never been such a deluge in memory of one person. The morning after her mother's death, Mary flew to Toronto from New York, where she had been living. That evening, she followed her dad up to his study, or junk room, as he called it. After quietly talking about the day's events, Willan suddenly leapt to the piano and played wistfully for about half an hour, improvising all the while as he was thinking of his beloved Nell.
And I came to see Dad every day after Mother died, or most days in the week, and we just talk about things. And we became very close friends. And one day he told me about his friend Bunny Green. Bunny Green was a medical student. They went to the opera one day, and you know they're sitting way up at the top. They're both of them poor as mice. Isolde apparently in the rehearsal had sat at the end of a bench in Act 2, in the interminable love scene, and Tristan had approached her, and that was fine. But in the performance, she sort of edged away from him towards the very end of the bench, and he approached her, and suddenly the bench went, and he fell on top of her, which was quite appropriate in the love scene. And these two clowns started laughing, and they couldn't stop. And they were asked to leave. I appreciated that. I love that story of my father being thrown out of Covent Garden.
There are many untold stories about Healy Willan, as he was a very private man. Albert Mann is one of the few who can recall some of the more obscure Willan anecdotes.
There was an occasion, because he would watch through his window upstairs and see what was happening. And he saw a bunch of children playing, and one of them went off the curb onto the roadway as a car came around the bend. And he said, I was sure she was going to be hit by the car. A huge being appeared, and it was an angel. Said, and lifted not the child, but the car. Lifted it up and put it down the other side of the child. He said, I've never told that to anybody else, and I never will.
I think Willan loved the idea of having a ghost sort of sitting around the church.
Willan's story at St. Mary Mag's was that of the Grey Lady. While he was practicing alone at night, he was really sure he saw a woman clothed in grey.
I don't think she appeared when it was choir, and she didn't appear during Mass or even song like that. But when Willan was there on his own, the Grey Lady would come and see him.
And when he went looking for her, she was gone.
And then the Grey Lady was at the house at Inglewood Drive. Don't think the Grey Lady appeared to Mary Mason and the children or to Mrs. Willan.
But I have my own theory, because I had an experience when I was down in that chapel wearing a grey suit, and I looked up to the gallery and I thought, well, that's where Healy Willan used to play, and here I am standing as a grey lady looking up where he used to be, and it was just this moment of strangeness where I thought, maybe in some shift of time and place he could be looking at me right now. or I could be looking at him in some future past universe. So you better not put that in your film, or I'll never get work again.
In 1997, a biography of Healy Willan was released, written by one of his students, Dr. Frederick Clark. The book also takes an in-depth look at much of his music.
It is a bit of a dry book. It's factual. I can't tell you there are any errors in it. When you've read it, you don't know Willan. You haven't met this pipe-smoking with the crinkling lines around the eyes telling you the latest limerick, which is usually a little bit off colour, let me tell you.
It's hard to reconstruct that. You know, what a person was really like. There's their sort of public persona, there's their writing, the work they accomplished, but to know what he was really like.
The thing about Willan is he could bite your head off, but 5 seconds later, you were pals again.
He would get mad, particularly at tenors, because they seemed to be much more raucous and so on than the basses. And I remember one occasion he said, "Bloody tenors." When the Almighty made a perfect imbecile, he invariably gave him a tenor voice.
I see him as a human being. He had all kinds of faults, like the rest of us.
It was an absolutely perfect way for a conductor to operate, if you want my opinion, because the faults were pointed out. They were pointed out rapidly, but they were not rudely. Lord help you if you got it wrong a second time round.
He did that little bit of history of himself. He says, "I'm Irish by extraction, English by birth, Canadian by adoption, and Scotch by absorption."
There was a young lady of Wantage, of whom the town clerk took advantage. "Indeed, you must pay her," said the borough surveyor. "You've totally altered her frontage." And he tittered like mad at that one. That was one of his favourites. But no more limericks. That'll have to do for the limericks.
Mary Mason has many of her own anecdotes about her father, but probably none more personal as the day she was married, and Ernest Macmillan, conductor of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, was the organist.
Ernest Macmillan played going in. Dad left his place beside Mother and went and sat beside Ernest on the bench and shifted his to get him to move off, and he shifted back, so the two of them were shifting away, and they were four hands on the organ, and it played me out.
Dr. Willan played for our wedding. We had 3 choirs. Something that has always bothered me is that I don't know what music he actually played because I was getting married. But it was beautiful. A gift, a very treasured gift.
In 1967, Healy Willan's vision worsened and he needed cataract surgery. He also experienced a series of heart attacks which forced him to convalesce at home. Even with these infirmities, Willan refused to stay away from his beloved St. Mary's during the Christmas Eve service.
He insisted to the doctor that he should let him out for that. And I suppose the doctor's feeling was, well, he hasn't got that much to go, so let's see how he can manage it. So they let him do it. And it worked. Everybody is totally surprised that he comes for the service.
As the service came to a close, Willan slowly climbed down from the organ bench, as he had for nearly 50 years, patted the console, and said, "Goodbye, old girl."
When the service was ended, they got the impression that he was well again. Nothing had changed. But he came down to the bottom of the steps, and I met him there. And he said to me, "Well, old man, that's the last time I shall go up those stairs." I said, "No, there are lots more." But we both knew he was right.
It was Keith Macmillan, son of Sir Ernest, who had introduced Giles Bryant to Dr. Willan at the Arts and Letters Club in the 1960s. The younger Macmillan offered Giles the substantial task of cataloging all of Willan's music.
And we got it to a pretty good state. He was happy, I was happy. Keith Macmillan, who was in charge of the Canadian Music Centre, was happy with it. And we were sort of thinking, right, that one can be sort of typed up and put away. And Willan died.
I was the only one in the room when he took the last breath. It was February. It was cold. The first thing I did was rush to one of the windows and open it wide. And I never understood why it was instinctive. I never understood that. And it was Dora Maver Moore, who was, we were having supper as we frequently did when I was working. She'd call up and say, come on up and bring those dinners, TV dinners, and we'd sit in front of her fireplace and gossip. At one point she wanted to know about Dad's death, and I told her. And I said, I ran to the window and opened it wide. Why did I do that? And she said, you know why you did that. You're a Celt. I said, oh, to let the soul fly free? She said, of course. Interesting.
Healy Willan died in his sleep in his own room on Friday, February 16th, 1968. His funeral service was 3 days later. There was no eulogy and no organist. The choir sang 2 motets, including one by Willan. Well-known musicians came from all over North America, and Sir William Mackay flew from England to attend the service.
And the church was packed, and the gallery choir, as it was called, the choir of the church, and Albert Mann and his ritual choir up at the front singing plain song. And I don't suppose there was a dry eye amongst any of those choristers, and there were probably quite a few wet faces amongst us down in the congregation.
Giles Bryant, with the help of Mary Mason, spent a couple of years locating and organizing Dr. Willan's manuscripts. Renowned musicologist Helmut Kuhlmann managed to trace dozens of letters from all over the world. These manuscripts and letters were subsequently donated to the National Library of Canada in Ottawa.
To Dr. Healy Willan, I very much hope we can greet each other at the end of this luncheon, if Saint Cecilia will give us grace so to do. Signed, Herbert Howells. Also a letter congratulating Healy Willan on his 80th birthday and praising his music, also signed, yours very sincerely, Herbert Howells.
And Mary and I did a lot of work at Inglewood Drive, clearing up manuscripts and that kind of thing. And I love to tell the story. We thought we had it all done. We were sort of practically having a glass and saying, right, that's it. And Mary said, oh, I just thought there's a little room at the top of the house. I wonder if there's anything in there. And we opened a cupboard and we're nearly killed by the amount of manuscript music that had been in this cupboard for donkey's years. And it was all the stuff that young musicians would do. String quartets, piano quartets, startings for symphonies that never got very far, songs, very little organ music, very little church music, mostly all that kind of thing, overtures, all kinds of stuff like that. And so, we have to start cataloguing all over again. And I think if you were to talk to him sitting here, what would you like to be known by? And the answer would probably be the opera, because that was so big.
Willan's opera Deirdre, with libretto by John Coulter, was the first full-length Canadian opera broadcast on the CBC in 1946. 20 years later, it was produced by the Canadian Opera Company. The performances were immensely popular, and the full score was set to be published in 1968. It was just about ready in the week of Willan's death. He had been working on it, correcting the proofs, until the day he went into hospital. Healy Willan was predestined to follow a life of music. As a young man, he was acquainted with Dvorak, Strauss, and Puccini. Now he had left the world a great number of musical gifts himself. In so doing, he was the recipient of many gifts from a grateful adoptive country, for Willan was awarded the prestigious Order of Canada upon its creation in 1967. Willan was also placed on a stamp issued by Canada Post in 1980 to celebrate the centenary of his birth.
I think it was Robertson Davies who famously wrote in the Saturday Night Magazine that the two important things to see in Toronto were the Chinese exhibit at the Royal Ontario Museum and St. Mary Magdalene's.
If you walked along the streets of Toronto in 1930, we'll say, and you said, I met Willan the other day, I bet you an awful lot of people would say, oh, Willan, yeah.
Healy Willan wouldn't have been who he was without that community supporting him. And it's a testament to that because he had offers. He had people in California trying to tempt him away to compose film music, and he thought about it, but he said, no, this is my home. I want to be here making music, especially at St. Mary Mag's.
You could argue that the greatest thing about his legacy to the cultural community of Toronto or Canada writ large was, in the people that he influenced and mentored, who then shared what they learned with their students and with their colleagues. So it was building the culture through example and through inspiration.
He'd actually taken his little attaché case and pulled out a manuscript, and he slid it over the table to me. He says, there, look at that, old man. Says, that's the last one. It was the number 14 of his Missa Brevis that he'd written. I said, oh, I notice you haven't given this a name. And he said, oh, I haven't, have I? And he mumbled something or other, and he says, oh, what was that, the church you went to in England? Oh, I said, St. Alfred's. He said, yes. He says, I remember that when I was in England. And he took out his pen and unscrewed the top and wrote diagonally across the front, St. Alfred's, which was the church that I went to. I started singing at the age of 7. I later on realized that there was no accident. He'd arrived already having decided to give it that name.
So this was
And
his way of
that was his way of
dedicating a piece to you.
That's right, yeah.